Okay, we are going to kick it off. We have quite a few people on board right now, and I have a wonderful honor tonight of introducing Senator Perkins Coca. She is a very accomplished person. She grew up on the Seacoast and has a very long legacy of public service. She was in the Peace Corps in Senegal, served 2 terms on the Portsmouth City Council, and she has many other roles on the Seacoast, including Commissioner of the Portsmouth Housing Authority. She's been a very strong advocate, and as a senator, she's made supporting working families and small businesses her top priority. She's a green energy lawyer and is general counsel for a company in the renewable energy field. Rebecca and her wife live in Portsmouth and are parents to 3 adorable daughters. And she is currently serving her 3rd term in the New Hampshire Senate. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Senator Perkins Coca. Take it away.
Yes. Well, hi, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here to join the Hillsborough County Legislative Wrap-Up. I am here as a cameo from outside Hillsborough County, just to kind of introduce our wonderful panelists tonight and help facilitate the discussion. So I know some of the other folks on the screen are familiar to you, but we'll be hearing tonight from Senator Fenton from my body, Representative Megan Murray, Representative Catherine Rumbo, Representative Rosemary Rung, and Representative Wendy Thomas. So we look forward to hearing from each of them on their respective work in their committees, which, have a nice sort of complementary spectrum across all the different subjects that you guys have sent questions in about tonight. So I just wanted to start off with a little bit of conversation on, what's going on up at the legislature. Both House and Senate had on Thursday sort of our last day to act on pieces of legislation on the floor. So we are now going into committee of conference season. And one of the last bills we had to act on as the Senate was the budget. So that was on the floor on Thursday, as well as about 22 other, regular pieces of legislation. So Senate was in session for I think just under 10 hours. Senator Fenton can correct me if I'm wrong. And we spent about 3.5 hours of that debating the budget. Obviously, the Senate Democrats are in a super minority. There's 8 of us and 16 Republicans. But this budget is a really bad budget. There's about $1 billion in services that have been up to be cut. And we saw obviously the House sort of slash that $1 billion from the budget. The Senate restored about a quarter of it. And they've been patting their back about some of the, sort of terrible consequences we've been able to avoid. But I think really the story we've been telling is this is still a bad budget. There's still $750 million that has been taken out. And essentially the arsonists don't get credit for putting out the fire. If you make a budget terrible and then you improve it slightly, it doesn't make it a good budget. It's not a budget that moves forward on housing or moves forward on childcare, lowering healthcare costs, lowering our utility bills. These are really the things that Granite Staters asked for in this budget. So that's a message that we reinforced on the floor on Thursday. We had 12 amendments that we brought in succession that pointed out that the spending in this budget represents choices. So each of our amendments redirected the spending out of the universal school voucher system into the priorities that Granite Staters asked for. So I've clipped and put up a couple pieces of our debate. Senator Fenton and I had a few exchanges in there and some of the stuff I put up. But, we essentially said, let's take $30 million out of vouchers and put it into housing. Let's take $30 million out of vouchers and put it into, lowering utility costs. Let's restore the university funding to full funding. Let's make sure we have money for childcare that's going to actually work. So that was a lot of what Senate Democrats did Thursday. And again, it was a long debate. And and I think, we wrapped up with a sort of closing statement on it, and the Senate president came down and did the same. But the vote in the end was actually 14-10 because there were two Senate Republicans who voted against it as well, Senator Murphy and Senator Sullivan, for very different reasons. For them, the spending was still too high, but it's an interesting dynamic going on in the Senate right now. So I'll leave it there in terms of the budget, but happy to answer any questions about that. And of course, Senator Fenton can add to what the debate was on Thursday. Some of the pieces that were not fully restored are Office of the Child Advocate. That remains to be, sort of directed differently and had some funding cut. They can't advocate fully for what they were able to do before. We were able to get Momnibus into the budget, but we can't call it Momnibus. It's just called the, mom's maternal health piece. We were able to see some funding in there for the Sununu Youth Center settlement, but not full funding. In fact, it was only about $20 million that went in, plus, hoping that the sale of the Sununu Center would result in additional funding. The university system funding at this point sits at about 85 million. And I know Representative Rung probably has some thoughts about what might happen in committee of conference on that. So happy to answer questions about all that. In terms of committee work, this year I'm on election law and I do a lot of work as the co-chair of the Housing Caucus. And again, Senator Fenton is on the Commerce Committee, so I will let him cover a lot of the housing bills. But, essentially, this is the number one issue in the state. And we saw, I think, over 60 bills on housing at the beginning of the session. And so a lot of what we've done in Housing Caucus is try to direct that agenda in a bipartisan, bicameral way to make sure that the bills, that were sort of gaining traction were ones that were really going to move the needle from a technical perspective. At this point, a lot of them have been tied up one way or another. So there's really, on the number one issue in the state, there's no money in the budget to address affordable or workforce housing. And there's a very few number of bills, I think, that are going to make it through the legislature. So that's tough to see, and also just again reflects the fact that this really isn't about Granite Staters' priorities. It's about other things. So election law, we've had, I think, a relatively quiet session. I was on the redistricting committee, so that was a very busy year for me. But this year, a lot of the bills that were really problematic in the Senate, we were able to redirect or really kind of scuttle. A couple made it through, including a lot of restrictions on absentee voting. And I think there's still more to come in terms of seeing how that will work out. But, we saw HB 1569 last year, which made it much more difficult for people to register same day. What we saw this year is focused on absentee to kind of line up the requirements with that same thing. So when we go to vote, we need to prove four things: age, citizenship, identity, and domicile. And so what we saw was that citizenship and identity and domicile, those things all now are going to need to be established if these pieces of legislation pass at the time of absentee registration and even at the time of collecting an absentee ballot, depending on which version passes. So those are pieces that I think, just continue to undermine the system. But again, there were other pieces that were potentially more harmful, including sort of tying university enrollment to the ability of college students to vote, which would have also undermined in and out of state tuition. There were pieces, just trying to think of some of the other stuff that we got rid of that did, sort of try to attack voting rights across the board that, we were able to stop for one reason or another. So we'll see how the session wraps up. But that's kind of the priority, is to watch that absentee voting and registration piece. So I will kind of leave it at that. I want to leave time for our panelists to be able to answer questions from inside Hillsborough County and sort of ones that you guys have sent in. So I'm going to start by introducing Senator Fenton, and who is a dear member of our caucus, and let him kind of talk about what his work and focus has been this session, and start to answer questions. Thank you, Donovan.
All right, so it's my turn now, I think. Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Glad to represent Hillsborough County. I think Katie said I'm your only state senator, which is cool, so I appreciate that. A little about me. I'm the state senator from District 10. I'm a lifelong Keene resident, born and raised here. I'm a small business owner. I have three kids as well. Same with Senator Perkins Coca. We share a lot of crazy stories when you have three kids, so it's fun. And we just celebrated my daughter's 1 year old, her first birthday this weekend. So, like a lot of you, I'm balancing a lot between family, business, and public service. And it's a volunteer job, so we all bring that perspective to Concord with us. We're here to get things done for working people, our small towns, and our families. We really just want a fair shot. And this year I served on four committees: transportation, commerce, ways and means, and capital budget. So I was involved in debates from everything from, immigrant rights and zoning reforms to tax policy, public infrastructure. It's a lot, but it gives you a 360-degree view of kind of what's happening in our state. Especially in transportation committee, we saw, a couple of truly, troubling bills that target, immigrants. And those bills were HB 452 and 461. And HB 452 would have removed driver's licenses from certain immigrants, depending on your visa status or where they were in the naturalization process, even if they were here legally and authorized to drive. Just a crazy bill that was, really cruel and unnecessary. Because we're talking about working people, contributing to our communities. And, the good news is that, this bill was re-referred to committee, hoping it doesn't come back next year, but you just never know. Another bill was 461, which would have banned the DMV from testing or banned the DMV from using testing materials in languages other than English. And it would have outlawed the use of interpreters. Another just crazy bill. It's not about safety, it's about exclusion, really. And the Senate did vote this one down, so that one's not coming back. On Ways and Means, a really fun committee. Our job is to look at how New Hampshire generates revenue. Budgets are our priorities. Sorry, my son is in the other room watching Ghostbusters. The budget's pretty much our priority, but you can't fund, our schools, our healthcare forces, our public safety with figuring out the actual revenue of that. And our committee has to really dig in kind of the fiscal proposals in this year's budget, especially the growing push for expanded gambling, which is another way to boost state income. What was kind of proposed this year was, slot machines at charitable casinos, the state taking a portion, and the House estimated that it could bring in around 200 million, which I thought was extremely high. I don't think those numbers are accurate. Another option was letting casinos stay open 24/7 with no caps on betting amounts. And that's really meant to increase kind of the tax revenue. A new system of video lottery terminals, or VLTs, was proposed. I think we had 30% tax rate with 65% going to the state and 35% going to charities. So, Ways and Means it's an interesting committee. It's a lot of gambling issues, but also, we set the numbers for what the fiscal committee is going to use. And, with gambling, I'm not a gambler. I'm not for or against it, but I do believe, we need to kind of go into gambling with eyes wide open. It can't just be about, flashy projections. We really need regulation and transparency, because gambling, might be part of the puzzle for revenues, but it's not a long-term substitute for a fair and modern tax system. And Governor Ayotte is really gambling on gambling in this budget. So I think she's got to be really careful with that. Another committee I sat on was capital budget. Now we focus on long-term investments in kind of the state's physical infrastructure. It's a fun committee. And we're talking about, higher ed facilities, court renovations, clean water projects, and other public assets that essentially get overlooked. It's not the most sexy committee, but it's, critical to our economy and kind of our quality of life. And these are one-time funds that go a long way. We really have to use them strategically. Senator Perkins Quokka mentioned, I sit on commerce, and this session was packed with housing related legislation. A lot of it I supported and helped shaped. I think housing was probably the biggest policy areas we tackled this year. We want to make sure that, we're building more houses, but we also want to make sure local communities keep a voice in the process with zoning. We passed HB 631, which requires municipalities to allow multifamily development on commercially zoned land. A really important step in unlocking more housing opportunities where infrastructure exists. We also voted on HB 577, which expands our accessory dwelling units, ADUs, to include kind of detached units and increases square footage to give homeowners a little bit more flexibility. And the big argument too we had was, local control. And we tried to find the middle balance there about, pushing back on proposals that went too far or didn't give towns the tools they need to kind of grow responsibly. Um, and I've said it before, we need housing, but we need to do it smartly. And I think that means listening to our municipalities and making sure the state is a partner, not a bulldozer. In some other bills, SB 84, which sets a reasonable maximum lot sizes, SB 284, creating opportunity with respect to the charging capacity of our communities to grow along the way. So, zoning reforms were huge. And housing was huge. One last bill I should probably mention in commerce was an interesting one, especially because it's my business, is HB 649 that would eliminate New Hampshire's annual vehicle inspection requirement, which is I am in the automobile industry, so I see a lot of cars that get inspected, and it'll be terrifying to have these cars on the road that aren't inspected. We had law enforcement come out, we had tow truck drivers come out, first responders come out. A portion of it did pass in the budget where I think a new car is exempt for 3 years, but there's still annual inspections. So, I'll close with this. Every bill we vote on affects someone's life. It might be, children in school or a family that just wants to go to work safely. So, a lot of bills we touched on this year. A couple bills that it's not all doom and gloom. I got some good bills passed dealing with school lunch for low-income children that hopefully will get to the governor's desk, and updating some of the public safety laws. So, that's kind of what I worked on in a nutshell. The budget's been a big portion of, Senator Perkins Coca's led very well on the budget. And yeah, happy to take any questions that you guys have for me or move on.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Fenton. We do have a few questions in the chat. Maybe we can just cover as they come up here. So the first question is, which bill will make it into HB2, SB 295 with the amendment, or HB 115? And what we saw on Thursday, and I know Representative Murray, you might want to add to this during your answer, was SB 295, I think, was passed in the House with the amendment that they wanted, that essentially would line it up with Sharon Carson's version of, sort of a capped program. But every time 90% of the cap is reached, the cap expands. So it's this ever receding cap, essentially. And I think they lined up the two versions in the two chambers. So we tabled 115 in the Senate on Thursday, and I believe they sent 295 to the governor's desk. But Representative Murray, you can add to that too. And then it says, did you say UNH's funding is 85 million in this budget? Doesn't that amount put the funding under the public school budget for some towns? That's a good question. We had essentially, we were trying to get the funding back to 96 million for the year, but we had Senator Ennis make the point in Finance Committee that in 2006, we were funding UNH at $100 million. So adjusted for inflation, to maintain that funding level, we really should be funding the university at $160 million a year. So we are at half, essentially, of what we should be funding UNH at. I will have to look into whether it's under some town school budgets, but it should be, because I know in Portsmouth, when I became a city councilor, we had roughly $100 million budget. We had about a $49 million school budget. So I imagine you're probably very right. And then someone asked, what services in the state for problem gamblers? I know, Senator Fenton, you were mentioning that the gambling was a big piece of the budget. I don't know if you heard anything about that in committee you want to comment on.
Yeah, a lot of reasons we didn't pass some of these, or Democrats voted against some of these gambling bills, was there's no services for gambling addiction. And we actually had organizations from outside of New Hampshire come in and testify saying, look, you're wanting to let the genie out of the bottle, but you have, no guardrails here in place for that. So, I have a handshake promise from a Republican colleague that we're going to work on that this year to get more addiction services for gambling and things like that. But it's certainly a priority for us.
Okay, great. Great. Well, thank you, Senator Fenton, for all of that super interesting information. If you guys have further questions, feel free to drop them into the chat as we go here. I am now going to ask
into the Q&A.
Bev's giving me a little finger here. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, the question should go in the Q&A, not in the chat.
I'm sorry. Your questions should go in the Q&A. That's where I will see them. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
No problem at all. So I want to introduce Representative Megan Murray, who wears multiple hats that we see her often and doing her hard work for the state. And I know she's got a special focus on education that she's going to talk to us about tonight.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Senator Perkins-Coca. For those of you that don't know me, I represent both Amherst and Milford here in Hillsborough County. I serve currently on the House Education Policy and Administration Committee, and I'm also the chair of the Hillsborough County delegation. And tonight I'm going to talk about a few key bills and topics coming out of both policy and administration as well as ed funding. And there's been a lot going on this year around education, as Senator Perkins-Coca kind of alluded to around Senate Bill 295, which I'll get to. But really, the primary sort of three buckets that we were seeing a lot of our bills coming out of House education policy were around what I would consider constitutional type of issues, bills that erode local control and taxpayer accountability, as well as like just gumming up the works in general around that. And then a third sort of area with regard to impacts around the special education community. Of course, there were others outside of there, but those are sort of the three areas that I'm going to focus on. And so around our constitutional issues, one of the bills that two bills that came forward was initially a bill that I co-sponsored with Representative Petrino around House Bill 50, which was seeking to simply repeal what was deemed already an unconstitutional bill around divisive concepts. That bill sort of got taken over by the Republican chair of the committee, and he filed a non-germane amendment onto that bill. And there was a bill, a companion bill in the Senate called SB 100. And that bill, it was also had an amendment tacked onto it very sort of late in the session. And that bill, not only did it continue to put teachers in sort of a fearful position about teaching the honest truth and sort of that sort of avenue. But what was interesting about the amendment attached onto SB 100 was they kind of took it a step further and added some language around affirmative action and banning the adjustment of anything that would deal with basically systemic racism or higher education around those issues. And so that was something new that kind of got added there. And I think that when we see these types of efforts, we're seeing them, they're extremely dangerous because we're seeing a huge amount of socioeconomic stratification right now with regard to vouchers and the impact of higher education. And as Senator Perkins-Coca and Senator Fenton know, we rank 50th out of 50 in the nation for higher education funding. So it does, when we're talking about resources available to individuals who might not otherwise have had them, I think that that's something that we should be paying attention to. And that was something, like I said, that was new and a new caveat to sort of the divisive concepts bill. Additionally, there was a lot of conversation around trans athletes in school sports. And as we already know that there was an earlier version that was ruled a violation of Title IX. And I believe that this is also in violation of that. And this bill seeks to further take away those rights and efforts to use tropes of harm as a reason to disallow individuals from equitably being on school sports teams. And so that, obviously Republicans are clearly focused on that sort of narrative of othering and fear and harm rhetoric around those two bills. Then I wanted to talk about sort of the local control piece. We've been seeing a lot of bills kind of coming into the Education Committee around school administrative units with House Bill 292 and House Bill 765. One of the bills simply wanted to study SAU consolidation. Seems a little bit nerdy, but they were looking to just kind of get a feel for if it was even possible to take SAU units to one per county, with the exception of some larger districts. And then the second bill that I mentioned looked to make superintendents an elected position and be housed at the county level, at the county seat of government, which would totally be unworkable. And that's just, it's wild. And then we were talking about open enrollment. And this is a conversation that I think is a companion to the conversation of vouchers, and I'll explain why in a minute. So regardless of whether or not the sending school district had funds or if a receiving district had staff or support staff, Senate Bill 97 would open the door to allow folks to sort of transfer anywhere they wanted. There was also another effort that was statewide enrollment, and one was intra-district enrollment. So when we look at those types of things, it was really sort of opening the door wide for anything goes. You didn't really have to use manifest hardship, which was in the past a resource if needs were, if there was a need to transfer outside of the district. That still exists. This simply just kind of blows the doors wide off on that. And it also adds an additional sort of caveat that parents have to figure out transportation on their own. And I think that when we're talking about transporting students places, it would be 100% on the responsibility of the parent to get them to wherever they were choosing to try and enroll. And now we're talking about voucher expansion with regard to SB 295. On Thursday, on the House floor, Democrats worked doggedly through Representative Luno to insist on some taxpayer accountability, requesting that there be a full audit on vouchers. Many of you know that with regard to the voucher scheme, there was a very, very small audit done, and that audit found that 25% of the accounts that were looked at had errors so great that some in fact didn't even qualify for residency in the state of New Hampshire. And so there were a lot of issues around getting that money back and taking a look at how they even qualified in the first place. The out-of-state management entity that holds the money is located in the state of New York. And so those there are very few requirements to send data and information back to the state of New Hampshire, whereas our school districts have that mechanism in place through a form that they fill out yearly to talk about their expenses, and that gets communicated on a regular basis. The voucher system does not have any of that in place, and with regard to taxpayer oversight and accountability, that is a very sort of sticky wicket. And then there's one other bill that kind of came up, and I think when we're talking about efforts at the federal level that could impact the state, SB 34, which was called basically a Medicaid parental consent bill, that said that each new encounter that a parent would have with medical services within the school district would need to have to be signed off, and a parent would have to consent to that each and every time that there was a new code entered into the system, if you will, which could essentially slow school reimbursement down and also delay services to the student. So I'll definitely be watching that in the future as well, because I think we need to be paying very close attention to what's happening with that regard as it regards to Medicaid. And then I was saying about gumming up the works a little bit. There was a House Bill 55, which was a ballot initiative, and I'm not on election law like I think Senator Perkins Coilca or Senator Fenton is. So it came to our committee, and it was regarding initiatives that would require that for any school budgeting and warrant articles or budget bills at the local level, that a cost per pupil mechanism be listed on the warrant article and a proficiency score. And the impacts to that could be really large because it could, like the ballot itself could be quite long. And it doesn't appear to be that there's any sort of funding mechanism associated with it to adjust for the fact that this may be a additional cost to the towns and municipalities. And then finally, I was talking about special education. And there were a myriad of bills being set forth to make changes to special education law this year before a complete and full audit is even being done, which there is currently an effort to do those audits. And so while that is still going on, there was testimony and drafting of several bills. Republican sponsors routinely had a lot to learn about how they interacted with and addressed and heard testimony from the disability rights, family, and community stakeholders. In one instance, a family came to our committee testifying about impacts about assistive technology in their classrooms, and routinely the families were being challenged and told not to use the device in the committee room as a test when they were testifying, and told it was a prop. And it was unfortunate to see that what should have otherwise been a teachable moment to the entire committee turned into this ability to really stifle speech and disenfranchise the individuals trying to testify. And additionally, we saw some other efforts with our Republican colleagues filing amendments to bills with regard to special education and not really inviting the special education community fully to the table to have an input in that. And that was also disappointing. So with that, I'm just wanting to make sure that we're paying close attention to the cuts that could impact state special education funding with regard to federal implications of Medicare and Medicaid. It'll be interesting to see because they are cutting some funding. Department of Education federally has about 15% of an estimated cut to the Department of Ed. But there is funding going into IDEA, but they're pulling other aspects of special education and other funding into that umbrella of IDEA funding. So I'll be very curious to see if there's actually an increase to funding like they're claiming. As of right now, it doesn't look like there really is going to be an increase in funding, which our states actually need, especially New Hampshire needs funding. So that was a little bit long-winded, but I'll take any questions that someone might have.
That's great. Thank you so much, Megan. And we do have a few questions here. So some relate directly to what you were just saying, but let's start at the beginning. So one says, are Medicaid benefits being put on the local property taxes? So that's a little bit of a complicated question, but essentially, to the extent that there are obligations that the state does not honor, and these are services we know people will need, they are going to land on our local taxpayers. So in the case of Medicaid benefits, there's not a direct, piece of legislation or legislative language that will do that, but the overall effect will be, that there are costs passed down to the local property taxpayers, some of which will come from needing assistance at the local level based on this budget. Okay, the next question is, how many trans athletes are asking to compete in sports in our New Hampshire schools? So, Representative, I don't know if you want to comment on this. The figure I have is 5.
Yeah, I think we're close. I was 4 or 5 as well. So that's what, and yeah, it's really unfortunate to see that, folks just want to play a sport and be a part of their community. And I'm happy to hear your thoughts too, Senator.
Yeah, I mean, what we've said on the floor on this is, that we will always support our transgender athletes and that we support every Granite Stater, and we all need to be here and live here. And also, what we should be spending our time in the chamber doing is solving the most urgent problems that there are for Granite Staters. They've asked us to take action on housing. They've asked us to take action lowering their medical bills, and instead we're raising them, and so we've tried to mitigate harm on some of these bills the best we can. We've offered alternatives. Those have not always been accepted, but I think we all know that in large part, this is a base messaging issue. It's a fear-mongering issue. And what the message on the floor in the Senate has often been, we need to protect our women and girls. And so in our last debate on the floor, we essentially said, we're so glad to hear so much concern for women and girls. If you'd like to support women and girls, we have a few ideas. How about further support for childcare? How about, more maternal health support? How about, additional ways we can lower costs for the average mother who's just stressing, right? And there's some really good data from Working Families project run by Mitch Landrew that had some interesting New Hampshire-based data if anyone's interested in looking into that. Okay. Some of our other questions. When a teacher is responsible for reporting alleged abuse of a student based on the student sharing with a teacher, if it is reported anonymously, does that teacher need to still speak with a parent of that reporting? So Representative, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
What we're talking about here, I think, was with regard to, first of all, every person in the state is a mandated reporter regardless. And I think if I'm understanding the question, if there is fear for a child's safety, there are mechanisms in place for us to ensure that children are safe and not harmed. However, the current piece of the Republican position is looking to, I think it was adjusted from 5 to 10 days. Within 5 to 10 business days, the person would have to respond in writing. Teacher would, if there was a question put forth in writing from a parent. So it opens the door to some confusion and possibly sharing information that a child or student is not yet ready to share.
Great. Thank you for that. Next question. When the audit is being done for EFAs, it will look at all expenditures being paid, not just the typical financials. So, Representative, again, I think that was directly in response to something you said.
Yeah, well, we hope so, right? I mean, we have asked for a full audit. Representative Luno on the floor introduced a floor amendment to the bill to say, hey, before the voucher went any further, lifting the income cap or removing it altogether or expanding it to 10,000 students without a funding mechanism. We want to look at this in detail, and the Republicans just shut it down entirely and dismissed that amendment and moved forward with the removal of the income cap and then like I said, expanding it from about 6,500 students all the way to 10,000 students from the House position, and without funding attached to it at all to address that.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving. There's a couple more questions. I'll sprinkle them in after our next speaker. Thank you guys for being an active audience. We always like to talk about what's interesting to you. And thank you, Representative Murray. That was great. So now I'd love to turn it over to Representative Catherine Rombo from Bedford. And I know, Catherine, you're going to talk a little bit about your service on judiciary. Talk to us about some of the reproductive freedom bills. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator. Yes, hi, I'm Catherine Rombo. I am one of our 2 Democratic state reps from Bedford. We have 7 seats for our district. And I previously had the pleasure of serving on House Transportation with Senator Fenton a couple of years ago. But now I am on House Judiciary, and I've been practicing as an attorney for the last 20 years. So the hope is that would give me some useful framework heading into this year. But as I think anyone can tell you, serving in these committees makes you realize how much there is to learn at any given time. And judiciary is a very broad committee. So If it's helpful, the actual description of the committee is that we are considering matters relating to the judicial system, right to know law, guardianships, life and death, such as abortion or assisted death, landlord-tenant rights, civil proceedings, tort law, forfeiture, immunity, and probate, and other matters that might be referred to the committee. So it is broad. And I thought it might be worth mentioning to you sort of by the numbers of how many bills we get. And I don't know if this is true for all committees, but in terms of what we get and what we come out with, the House Judiciary Committee had 60 or 61 bills referred to it this term. 22 of the bills were voted down, 14 were retained, so they can come back next year. 12 were passed with some amendments, 8 were tabled. Or maybe there were 16 bills retained. We had 2 bills I know of in committees of conference right now, although I'm not totally sure what the final number is. And 1 bill signed by the governor so far, which is a sort of administrative bill that has to do with succession planning for small professional limited liability corporations. I mention all that just because I think it's interesting how many bills we get and how many bills we actually come out with at the end of the year. So we have a lot of bills that get a lot of noise, I think, but they don't all come through. And I think it feels very important to us on the committee. I think that we're all vetting them very carefully. And I know that's true for the Senate as well. So some of the themes that we saw this year were similar to some other committees. There were a number of anti-trans legislation attempts, bills that had to do with bathroom bans, as well as sports team bans. In terms of the bills that came to judiciary, that wrapped up trans kids in sports with also which bathrooms you can use in various public spaces. I felt like we're intentionally wrapped together and are very different issues in some ways, and all with the same intent of excluding and othering. So we had some really difficult hearings. I really appreciated, hundreds of people showed up for these hearings. And I just, for those who have been following along on those bills, I really appreciate the attention that's been given. Another theme this year was we had a lot of bills about library cards and access to library records. And there are some representatives from, you may have heard from Goffstown particularly, that were very concerned about this because I guess there have been some issues in the last year or two about whether people had library cards or not was disclosed. So they wanted there to be bills that whether you or not you have a library card is a private record and can't be disclosed. And that there were going to be very severe penalties in some cases, whether they were inadvertently disclosed or not. The Senate got rid of a bunch of those bills, I believe. But then some of them have gotten tacked back on as amendments to Senate bills coming back to us in the House. So I'm not totally sure what the status of some of those are right now. And Senator, you might be able to chime in on that as well. But and then the other library related bill I'm thinking of is that there was a bill that did pass that would require libraries to share the records of a child's records of what they checked out to a parent who can prove same residence by their address on their license. I think there were a lot of concerns about the logistics of that bill and whether there might be kids who are not in safe circumstances and the reasons why they're perhaps whether parent would be looking for that information, but that also went through. So library bills are big this year. We had also, some of you may have been following, we had the medical aid in dying bill return, as it's sometimes referred to. We had a very long hearing earlier this year. A very emotional hearing. Those are really tough bills, right? Because you hear from people on both sides have very strong feelings about whether people, what the parameters should be if we pass any bills that allow people to make decisions for end of life decisions. It got tabled by a very narrow margin. So that bill is not going forward at this point. The other bills I was asked to talk about with a focus on reproductive health care and abortion, I was noting to some of the other panelists earlier, interestingly, we actually didn't have a ton of abortion-related bills in House Judiciary this year. And I don't think that's a coincidence, or I don't think it's an accident in some ways, because you may recall there was a 15-week ban bill proposed that drew a huge turnout, a lot of opposition. and the sponsor of the bill withdrew that bill, or we had to vote on the House to withdraw it, and it was withdrawn. And my understanding, not that I'm in, all the inside rooms on these discussions, my understanding was that there was a lot of pushback. The governor's office did not want it, that leadership did not want it because on the Republican side, because it was just a deeply, deeply unpopular bill. So it was withdrawn. Otherwise, we had, I guess, that one bill that was withdrawn, and then we had a bill. The other related bill to abortion care was the Rights of Conscience for Medical Professionals, HB 232. It was a bill that would have permitted anybody who worked in a facility that provided reproductive health care services or contraception services. They could turn away a patient or a customer without providing alternative care direction or even telling anybody it's a medical care provider. They couldn't lose their job for that. And the way it was written was so broad that it basically, you could interpret it that somebody at a store could refuse to sell condoms to somebody at a CVS because it interfered with their religious beliefs. And there was a request to have the sponsor amend it. And he said, oh, yes, we can be clear about that. It didn't get amended that way. There was a lot of back and forth. So, what ultimately happened is it was retained. I think even though we were in the Democrats were in the minority on the committee, there were enough Republicans with concerns about this bill that they held it back. So I don't know where we will be with it in the new year. But it was very concerning. It was very broad. And then the other bill that was not explicitly about abortion, but ended up being part of the discussion was SB 189, the fetal death records bill. And it was really, the intention was to move paper records to electronic records for fetal death statistics. And the way those are compiled, really, they're records for stillbirths after 20 weeks. They did not include abortion data. And there were some members of the committee who wanted to hold up, they wanted to have abortion data considered or felt that should be part of the consideration with the bill. So that, I believe, also ended up getting retained. I'll need to double check on that one. Those are my updates on abortion healthcare related bills and judiciary. I'm happy to take any questions also.
Okay, great. Thank you, Representative. We have a few in the chat that are not, or sorry, in the Q&A that I don't think are.
I see one at the bottom of the abortion bill. There was a bill for 15 days last year. That was also crazy, but this was actually a 15-week ban this year. Those are two different bills.
Yep. And I think you summed it up perfectly. I mean, it was like, as soon as it was out there was such an outpouring that it quickly disappeared. So
yeah,
what we do matters out here. And thank you all, you guys, you really, what you do helps us get these changes in the State House. So, David Trumbull has asked, could you please tell us the final outcome of the open enrollment bills? And I don't think we can yet. I was just kind of looking around, SB 97 did pass both chambers. SB 101 was retained. And then I think there's a piece in the budget still. But I have to look at the final version based on Senate Finance Committee. But I don't think we acted on that. So sorry, David, for not having that answer at the tip of my tongue. But as you might imagine, right this moment is kind of a tough moment because there's been so much movement. And, I haven't even fully caught up with what went on the House floor on Thursday. So happy to follow up on that if it's helpful out of our office. And then can a school district vote against open enrollment? So any of the representatives, I don't know if you want to chime in here. Happy to.
Sure. So I think,
yeah.
Thanks, Senator. I think part of what we are noticing is an effort to sort of override that local control process right now. So to some degree, some of these open enrollment bills are looking to put it sort of at the state level and mandating it at the state level, saying that you must do these things if they're passed. And so whether it is intra-district enrollment or again, anywhere in the state, depending on what version ends up making its way through where, that is it is seemingly a tendency that the Republican caucus has been leaning towards. I mean, I think if you saw it somewhere else, Jason Osborne had said somewhere, well, if you don't impose tax caps yourselves at the local levels, we'll do it for you. So it's been a similar trend, unfortunately, that things have moved in that direction with regard to some of this stuff.
Okay, super helpful. All right. So again, I'm gonna keep us moving. And I'm gonna turn it over to Representative Rosemary Rung, who is our resident finance expert here. So hopefully, you can, touch on some of what's been going on with the budget, like we talked about. Obviously, the Senate version is slightly improved off of what was just a really sort of terrible baseline here. So I will leave that to you. And I just also need to step away for 1 minute while you're talking to go give some bedtime kisses. So I will be right back.
Thank you very much, Senator. And we got a glimpse of one of your daughters, and she's adorable. So go give those kisses. I'm in my 4th term. I'm representing the town of Merrimack along with 2 other Democrats, one of whom is on this call, Representative Thomas. But this is my first year on House Finance, and it is sort of like baptism by fire to sit on it. And Senator Perkins Quokka had mentioned about the budget choices that were made in the Senate. Well, what we saw at the House in House Finance, as these were more reflective of values and priorities of the Republican caucus. And they aren't anything like the Democrats' value. And so it was very difficult and contentious at times, particularly when motions were made to abolish the state library and cut out the Office of the Child Advocate and make disastrous cuts to the Department of Corrections and getting rid of the Human Rights Office. So it was a difficult process, but I was very fortunate that the finance Democrats were a very tight, very, very able group of people. We worked very well together, and I think held our own. We actually presented what was called our Better Budget Bill, which was an omnibus amendment that we presented to the full House. Unfortunately, there was drama that day. The budget was tabled. The caucus came back. We really never got to present that whole amendment. We did get some things, minor things recovered, but it was really relying on the Senate to fix some of these things. And they did, but it's sort of as though the Democrats, robbed someone of a loaf of bread, and then the Senate just threw them some crumbs back. So I don't know if it's enough to stave off starvation with many people, but it was some progress. And but I really want to talk about something that kind of goes maybe at a higher level than what we've been discussing so far, and that's to let people know that first of all, what we're going through now is self-inflicted by the Republicans. For the past 10 years or so, they have been cutting taxes. And this is the first year we've seen a total elimination of the dividends and interest tax. And so the budget issues we're going through now are really self-inflicted. The loss of revenue is a deliberate action over the years by Republicans. And since we no longer have ARPA money that we have been using the last several years, this has been a very painful process because we with the loss of ARPA money and with the loss of those tax revenues, it really gave us a big hole that was difficult to fill. And so I want to let people know that if they want more specific information on this budget and also on just the loss of revenue, that history, the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute has a great website where they've got a lot of documents and data, blog postings to explain this, to help people really understand that the spot we're in this year was long time coming. But I also want people to understand that what we're experiencing in New Hampshire is exactly what's going on in Washington. We have seen just a drastic cutting of government services. And I really, in my opinion, which I think I'm right, many of the Republicans saw this revenue shortfall as an opportunity to cut government that they've been wanting to cut for a very long time. And so, in fact, Representative Dan McGuire was speaking from the well at one session, and he had said that his favorite cut was this multi-million-dollar cut to the university system. And I don't know how anybody can see that as a favorite cut when you're really hurting Granite State students and their families with impacting their ability to attend a state university. UNH is already one of the most expensive in-state tuitions in the country, and their cuts to just make it worse. I was glad to see some of that was reinstated by the Senate. But what we see at the state, particularly with the revenue, the tax cuts that they've had, is they're favoring the wealthy. EFAs in particular, those first came on the scene as being sold as, well, we need to help low-income people attend, send their children to the school of their choice that meets their needs. But the EFAs don't cover the full tuition. They don't cover transportation. Many low-income families still can't send their kids to private school. It was really a setup to help the wealthy. Same thing with the elimination of the dividends and interest tax. There were exceptions on that tax that I forget the level of income that was exempted from the tax before it kicked in, but that's purely to benefit wealthy people. So what we've seen from the Republicans is just a continuing burden on families and seniors, particularly with downshifting of costs, because things that aren't going to be covered at the state level go down to that local level, and that impacts people's ability to stay in their homes, particularly seniors who are on a fixed income. We've seen one thing that was in this budget was an increase in fee. I don't think there was any fee that was safe in this budget. From a 50% increase in permitting fees for the Department of Environmental Services to court fees, registration fees, everything is going to have to be paid for by Granite Staters. And other things we've seen that mirror what's going on in Washington is anti-diversity, inclusion, and equity, and anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we've seen at the federal level is going on in New Hampshire right now. In fact, at the 11th hour in House Finance, as we were going through having our debate over the budget, an amendment was put through to ban DEI in the state, and it's still there. The Senate did amend that a little bit to change the definition of how that's applied, but it has nothing to do with the budget. But they use that budget opportunity to slip this in so that it wouldn't be subject to a public hearing as it would be if it was a separate bill. We've seen anti-immigration bills coming in, money being spent on the Granite Shield. That's in the budget still. I think it's a little bit lower. Maybe Senator Fenton might be able to know that, or Senator Perkins Quokka, but we're still spending money to defend this northern border, and that's money that's being taken away from public education, from Medicaid services, and everything else that really Granite Staters families need. We've seen anti-immigration bills. We've seen anti-trans bills. So what is going on in Washington, and the outrage people are having about that, is happening in our own backyard. And what we're experiencing isn't anything unique to this agenda of this far right, extreme political element that really wants to dismantle government and take away services that our people need to reach their potential and to be contributing members of society. So the budget still leaves us at risk for certain things. The number one thing is the YDC settlement fund. Even though it's funded at 10 million for 2026 and 2027, and the Senate amended that to have that 20 million all in the first year, it doesn't come close to the exposure that the state has. When that fund isn't fully funded, what's going to happen is it's going to incentivize victims to go through the court system for justice. And that's going to expose the state at a much higher financial liability than using that settlement fund. So that's still a really strong risk that isn't solved by this budget. Another issue is the adequacy funding. We've had lawsuits brought in decisions made in court that we are not adequately funding education. And I don't know where that's going to go, but this budget certainly is not paying for an adequate education in our communities. And then the other risk that we have to realize is that any cuts that are made in Washington are going to come back and hurt us, particularly as they apply to Medicaid. New Hampshire gets, I think it's nearly half of their revenue from federal Medicaid funding. And we are also called a trigger state. So if Medicaid funding gets cut at the national level at a certain percentage, it will automatically cut our Medicaid expansion in New Hampshire after 180 days. So that puts so many people that rely on Medicaid services, it puts those at risk for them. So we still see risks to the state that aren't addressed in this budget. But I do want to end on a positive note, and that is that many of you have made calls and emails to your representatives and senators, letting them know about things that you want to see or don't want to see in what they've done in the budget. And it has made a big difference. I can tell you when I was in Division 1 and there was a motion made by Representative Sweeney from Salem to eliminate the state library, we got him to just delay that until the next day. He did get through with eliminating the Council of the Arts, defunding that, but we did get him to wait on the state library till the next day. And between 5 p.m. and 10 a.m. the following day, there were hundreds of emails. I think every librarian in the state in the country had emailed us telling us not to do that. And he had to back out. The public pressure was just tremendous, because when we have that type of public outcry and that gets media attention, and the Republicans will back off a little bit. So I really look at this whole budget process as being a partnership with many of you that have really supported what we've been trying to do. And we'll just have to see what comes out of committee of conference. And this will also be a big test for the governor. So anyway, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
And we do have some. Thank you so much, Representative. All right, so I'll start with one that goes back a little bit in terms of topics. How many young people are asking to use a bathroom of another gender in New Hampshire schools? Is it easier to say how many districts are dealing with these concerns? So I don't know, Representative Murray, if you ever heard any testimony committee on this. This is not a figure I think we've seen floating around in our chamber.
Am I unmuted?
You are, yes.
Okay, great. No, I haven't seen a figure either. I do know that one of my districts did have, one of my towns in my district was contending with this very issue. And ultimately, they ended up having, there were, efforts to seek bathroom bans. And folks ended up backing off because there were some constitutional issues and civil rights issues. But as far as a specific number, I don't have that.
Okay. Thanks so much. It's a great point, though. Maybe focusing on how school districts are handling it could be another debate tactic. I agree.
Senator, could I just chime in on that? I feel like because we had some similar bills, in New Hampshire, and I felt like that was notable to me that there weren't really a lot. I mean, I don't have a number, but it's very anecdotal. There were some stories people did, it comes up, but when I tried to ask questions at committee, I was like, this is not what people are asking me about as a state rep. This is
Right.
not something that's
Right.
coming up at the end, is being handled as needed in most cases where it is, a concern. And I also found it interesting that in some instances when people testified very emotionally about why they felt uncomfortable with the idea of a trans individual using a bathroom that matched their current identity, it it tapped into something they were talking about, that they had assaults in their past, or they had had some sort of traumatic experience in their past, which I thought was interesting. That really had nothing to do with the people we were talking about, or the trans bill. And I feel like there were a lot of tangled up things in the people who were testifying in favor of these bills in some instances. So I hope that means we keep listening for what's really going on in these bills, I guess, when we hear testimony on them in the future.
Yeah. Great point, Representative. Thank you so much. So we have a comment. I agree about the tax revenues. I am not hearing anything about our loss of revenue due to many Canadians and Europeans not visiting New Hampshire. So this is a great point, and this is something we raised in our floor debate on Thursday in the Senate. I had a bill, SB 304, that asked for a report from the Bureau of Economic Affairs on what the tariffs would do to New Hampshire jobs and small businesses. Which, we had multiple businesses come in and testify on and say this shouldn't be a partisan issue. This is data you guys need. But the Republicans killed it. So we brought it back in the context of budget negotiations, because we said, the amount of Canadians visiting New Hampshire directly affects room and meals, or I think everyone's calling it meal and rooms now, different than when we used to pay it when I was younger. So it is a budget question, and it was germane. So we actually brought that as an amendment to sort of say, like, we should have something that's shoring up and protecting our small businesses in this time of uncertainty. We're certainly seeing the impact on the seacoast, in the North Country. So we don't have the data because they killed the bill, but certainly something that's on our mind. So thank you for that question. There's a question about conflict of interest with Senator Sullivan receiving an EFA and sponsoring bills related to EFAs, Majority Leader Osborne making money off of EFAs and working on, education freedom account bills. Yes, there are certainly some questions to raise here. And that will be an election year issue. So thank you for that comment. All right. I just want to make sure. I think we're doing well on timing. Katie can correct me here. But I do want to turn it over to, we are doing well on timing. Okay, we're 3 minutes ahead of schedule. I'm going to turn it over to Representative Wendy Thomas to share some thoughts about what's been going on this legislative session on energy, the environment, PFAS, and anything related to cannabis, if you would.
There you go. I got the easy ones.
Yeah.
So thank you. I'm Wendy Thomas, and I represent the town of Merrimack, along with Nancy Murphy and Rosemarie Rung, who's on this call as well. This is my second term on science, technology, and energy, which is really and should be renamed to energy, energy, and energy. The first term I was up, I was on resources. This past year was incredibly interesting in ST&E. It turns out that we are one of the more partisan committees, and anything that was renewable related was shot down. So some of the bad bills that we couldn't stop was a bill that allowed the PUC, which is the Public Utilities Commission, to subvert the system benefit charge. Another one was studying whether to withdraw from ISO New England, which is our New England energy grid. So the bill was to essentially set up a divorce, have New Hampshire be removed from the energy grid so that we're like Texas. And we all know how well that's working in Texas. Another bill that we couldn't stop was to define clean energy to include some not so clean energy sources like nuclear. Removing Class 2 solar from the RPS, which is the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Banning offshore wind in New Hampshire and disbanding the Office of Offshore Wind in the Department of Energy. allowing unregulated small energy providers, which is nuts. But that passed. And basically what that one was is that you could have some sort of an energy provider, whether it's you could run it on gas, you could run it on oil, you could do solar, you could do nuclear. And provided that you're not connected to the utilities, it could be unregulated. And there was also a bill that welcomes nuclear for Bitcoin and AI centers in New Hampshire. The Republicans are really pushing that one because it's the perfect, what they think is the perfect solution for New Hampshire. We have lots of land. We don't have a lot of people. So they want to set up these huge Bitcoin and AI centers, hopefully, they think hopefully powered by nuclear. And that would create business opportunities in New Hampshire. So what's the common thread of all of these bad bills where you've got deregulation, you've got clean energy that's being removed, you've got welcoming nuclear and Bitcoin and AI? The Free Staters and the Libertarians are still setting up New Hampshire for secession. And all of these bills are like cuts, or death by 1,000 cuts. They are all pieces of the puzzle that would eventually set up New Hampshire to secede from the Union. What we tried to do in our committee is we tried to rein in the PUC, which again is the Public Utilities Commission, by clarifying their role with the DOE, which is the Department of Energy. So we tried to put standardization in. That failed. We tried to make fair rates for condos when owners share meters for residential use. That was killed. We tried to promote energy storage and distributed energy resources. We tried to have cost underruns for default service be made up by only default service customers. And recently, the PUC ruled last week to do that in the Unitil case. So we got, the bill didn't go through, but a ruling from the PUC went through. We've tried to increase the feasibility of advanced metering. We've tried to expand net metering in various ways. We have tried to expand net metering for some of our most important businesses that were crying out for it as a way to cope with high energy costs that are impacting their ability to stay in New Hampshire. The Republicans killed that. We have tried to address climate change by setting up a committee to look at the cost to New Hampshire for all of the climate change damage that we're seeing on the seacoast and with flooding all throughout the state. And we tried to set up a department in DES to oversee climate change activity in New Hampshire. Both of those initiatives were killed. And I worked with John Gage on setting up a committee to investigate, not do anything other than to look at carbon pricing in New Hampshire and how it would affect our economy. And boy, that was killed very loudly by the GOP. So we did have two somewhat big wins. We saved something called the Energy Data Platform in the Senate hearing. The data platform was re-referred to the Senate committee in order to keep it alive so that the RFPs can move forward and the cost-benefit analysis can be completed by fall. So this is a project that has been a couple years in the making, and they were just on the cusp of releasing a report of their study over a few years, and the Republicans wanted to kill it. So it made no sense to get rid of that work, and the House couldn't understand that, but Kat McGee was instrumental in making sure that the senators understood that. So we did get that killed. Another big win happened as a direct result of our Dems on the committee's effort. And that is that in the House, for the budget, the Republicans wanted to take $10 million from the REF, which is the Renewable Energy Fund. And this is a fund that we pay into through our utility bills. And the money is supposed to be used for renewable projects in New Hampshire, which brings in money, it brings in jobs, it helps our economy, and it lowers the demand for energy. So the Senate now is only taking $8 million instead of $10 million. So at least we've saved $2 million of that fund, which, you know, it's kind of bittersweet, but at least we did that. ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, is going to be meeting this summer, and I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot of ALEC crafted restrictive and fossil fuel reliant energy bills next year. Janine Notter, she's very involved with ALEC, and I am positive we'll be seeing some very, very interesting energy bills from her. With regard to PFAS, and again, the Republicans don't like regulation. They don't like holding companies accountable. I think the only PFAS bill that got passed and was recently signed into law by the governor is a bill I brought forward that now bans PFAS added ski, boat, and board wax in New Hampshire. This is a compound that's on the bottom of your skis, about the bottom of your board, your snowboards and your boats, and it goes directly into our water supply. So it's just foolish to have it in the state. So that bill builded on a bill that was passed by Karen Ebel last session that banned certain PFAS containing consumer products in New Hampshire. And then finally, and yeah, I'm going to be way ahead of schedule. The only cannabis bill, and I work with a bunch of representatives on a cannabis caucus. Although we submitted quite a few cannabis bills covering legalization of adult use, criminal penalties, possession amounts, allowing dispensaries to use greenhouses and to become for-profit if desired. The only one that is still alive is a home grow bill for therapeutic cannabis patients. That I would not have put my money on that one being the sole survivor. But, sometimes things are kind of funny up there. It just passed the House and it's now going to a committee of conference and then back to the Senate. And if it passes, then it goes to the governor. So there are still several hurdles it would need to pass to become law, but we're getting closer and closer to passing this bill. And the House has passed a version of this bill every single session since 2009. It is not a free-for-all for anyone to grow cannabis. It is only for registered therapeutic cannabis patients in New Hampshire. But I've been working on that bill for, this is 3 years now, and we're getting closer and closer. So that's it for energy, PFAS, and cannabis. I'd be happy to take questions.
Well, thank you so much, Representative. We do have one question about landfills here. It says a man who works for a town recycle center said we cannot stop Vermont from dumping their trash near Bethlehem. Why is New Hampshire open to trash destroying our land while Vermont makes their state beautiful?
That's an excellent question.
I also, Representative Thomas.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I have some other thoughts or insight on that. I don't know if you have some thoughts about why that is occurring the way it is.
Everything that is illogical, you have to follow the money. I think that's what it comes down to is different corporations are making, like Casella, they're making money. Garbage is big dollars, because we all need to put it somewhere and nobody wants it. So I would say follow the money, but go ahead, give me your views on that as well.
Sure. Yeah. As a former deputy ranking member in Environment and Agriculture, one of the other common conversations that we were having around this was the Interstate Commerce Clause. And so there's always been this argument, well, we can't do this because New Hampshire can't act in the same ways that Vermont or maybe Maine has because of the Interstate Commerce Clause. But when in truth, the way Vermont and Maine were able to sort of do what they're doing is that they were able to pass regulations and rule changes that we are seeking in the same way. But they were able to do that through different requirements for permature to disallow certain things. And they essentially beat us to the punch on a lot of those things. And I think most recently we were able to again, under Representative Ebel, do a lot of work with construction and demo debris and disallowing some of that. But to your point, yes, it's very complicated.
Okay.
I
Well,
was actually going to
yes, please
the
go
same
ahead,
answer.
Representative. Yes.
As Representative Murray, because I was involved with that legislation that Representative Ebel brought forth. But we really need to change our approach to how we manage solid waste. There just isn't enough focus on reusing, recycling, encouraging certain types of materials over others. We know what we're doing now is not sustainable. If we want to decrease the amount of land that's opened for landfill. But it's very, like I said, like somebody else mentioned it, it's very difficult in this political climate, being in a minority, because the majority is very, very resistant to any regulation at all. And that's what it's going to take. And I do believe, Senator Perkins Coker, you can correct me, but I do think there was some money the Senate added to encourage solid waste reduction. Is that true?
I wasn't tracking that particular
Okay.
piece amongst the, kind of
Yeah, I don't
200
think it was
pieces I feel like
much.
we were tracking yet. No, so I unfortunately
Okay.
don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but so thank you guys all. This has been great. Really appreciate all the questions as well. It's 8:24, not to use every minute we have, but I also wondered, Representative Murray, if you wanted to comment on the county sheriff's interactions with ICE, and maybe just give an update on that. And then we're going to try to turn it back to Katie in 5 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. So as I'm switching, as you all know, every state legislator in the House serves as their county delegation member, and Senator Perkins Coker is correct. Hillsborough County Sheriff, around the 22nd of May, it appears, signed an agreement with regard to ICE. We still are unclear as far as the parameters under what he has signed specifically. But there are also conversations that you should be aware of with regard to the Department of Corrections asking for nearly $1 million. It's $750,000 roughly worth of money that is your county taxpayer money. And there is an inkling, a suspicion, if you will, that there is a consideration to potentially also not only enter into the 287G task force model contract, which the county sheriff has entered into, but also then house individuals in Manchester at the Department of Corrections. And so this request came before the executive committee and was snuck into the county commissioner's contingency line of their budget with no contract themselves at the Department of Corrections. There are types of contracts that departments of corrections across the country can enter into, called a jail enforcement model. To my knowledge, we have not seen anything like that come forward. However, it is our position as the Democratic caucus that the federal government is inserting itself into our county budgeting process in a couple of ways that are directly impacting my ability and the county delegation's ability to fiscally respond to all sorts of things that may then become county impacts and county financial impacts, whether it's a future and potential legal encumbrances, if there are issues around that, or if it is simply just shared services around our county sheriffs and our county law enforcement using the county paid for vehicles and uniforms and materials simply to do the work that ICE is asking them to do. And basically, this coming, not this week, but next week on the 18th and 19th, Hillsborough County will be taking up, there's a public comment period on the 18th at 5 p.m. for folks to be able to voice their opinion on what is happening happening in Hillsborough County, as well as on the 19th, the full delegation will be meeting to vote on the budget as a whole. And so this line item is in there with regards to the Department of Corrections. The Sheriff's Department has been very open and transparent with the fact that he is planning on having every one of his staff members deputized, and he considers that an effort to receive training. However, we have some very sincere concerns about all of the other things it entails when reading the 287G contracts across the state. It is very clear that there are certain financial responsibilities that the local law enforcement agencies and vis-a-vis the county will end up ultimately having to pick up as a result of whether it's just not being reimbursed from the feds in a timely manner, or there's other issues around litigation and civil rights issues that might come up as a result, which we're seeing across the country. So thank you, Senator.
Okay. Thank you, Megan, for your work on that, and for giving us an update. All right. And Katie, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Senator. Really appreciate you hosting tonight, and thanks to Senator Fenton and Reps Rumbo, Thomas, Rung, and Murray for being our guest speakers tonight. We also have many state reps on this Zoom tonight, so thank you for attending, and we really appreciate all the work all our Democratic legislators do. It's been an incredibly tough year given the lopsided nature of the count in the House and Senate, but they are working hard for all Granite Staters. So thank you so much. And let's all work hard for them over the coming 17 months to get some majorities in the State House and State Senate, Executive Council, and in the governor's seat. Thank you all for attending tonight. One last parting comment to mark your calendars. We have our annual Hillsborough County Dems picnic coming up, well, not coming up exactly, but in September 21st, which is a Sunday, 11 to 3 a.m. It's always a fun time. It's at its usual location at Oak Park in Greenfield, and we'll be getting some details out on that in midsummer, but it's a big fundraiser for the county so we can support down ballot candidates, and it's a great time to hear from our legislators and others. So thank you so much for coming tonight. Thanks to all our legislators. Have a good evening.
For having us.